As you may know, by October 1941, the German army was knocking on the door of Moscow. So confident was Hitler about taking the city that he'd even said, "We only need to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." A battle for the city began, which lasted for 3 months until the Germans were eventually pushed back by the Soviet army. But what if the capital of the Soviet Union fell to the Nazis? Let's dive in. It's been widely debated whether the fall of Moscow would have forced the Soviet Union to collapse. There are 2 main reasons people think so. First, Stalin had vowed to stay in the city, a kind of captain goes down with the ship scenario. If he died or was captured, Soviet leadership might have descended into chaos, like what happened during World War I, which they literally couldn't afford while fighting a war of survival against Hitler's war of extermination. Second, the loss of Moscow might have caused a national panic. The city hadn't fallen to a foreign power since Napoleon in 1812. Losing it to the Nazis would have been a huge psychological blow, but at that point, the Soviets had already lost about 9% of their territory. Would losing an extra percent or two really change the course of the war? By August 1941, the Soviets were already evacuating civilians and factories east of the Urals to avoid Axis bombings. By the end of the year, they'd relocated 16 million people and over 1,500 factories. The Soviets had, in the 1930s, already developed contingency plans for this to occur, although, given the state of affairs of the country during that time, when the war finally broke out in June 1941, councils needed to scour Moscow libraries for references on how this was done during the First World War. Let's say, though, somehow the Germans pull it off. They capture and hold Moscow. In real life, they got within 40 kilometers of the city, close enough to see the Kremlin. So, what would have changed? Moscow would have likely become the first true Stalingrad, a symbolically loaded city which eventually would have turned into rubble. Stalin knew how vital it was and would have fought tooth and nail. Hitler too saw it as a prize, a propaganda goldmine. The result? A destroyed capital, like Warsaw, gutted, burning and emptied. Rebuilding Moscow would have likely taken around a decade, with its population not returning to pre-1941 levels for another 15 to 20 years, if we use Minsk as a rough comparison. While Minsk wasn't nearly as significant as Moscow, its post-war recovery gives us a general idea of how long reconstruction and repopulation might have taken. The Germans had no regard for the Soviet Union's historical legacy or culture and viewed it as barbaric. They would have destroyed every symbol of communism and achievement of the Soviet people. Now, let's assume Stalin dies in the defense of Moscow. It's unlikely, he'd probably flee east, but let's go with his own words. What happens next? Not much, surprisingly. German troops would be stuck defending a frozen city in minus 28-degree weather with overstretched supply lines. They couldn't advance further until spring. So, even though they technically would have won and Hitler and Goebbels would be having a field day with a propaganda boost, it would have been a Pyrrhic victory. Symbolic, but hollow. Holding the city would have drained resources Germany couldn't replenish. The Nazis relied on blitzkrieg, fast, sharp invasions. The USSR was literally the counter to that. Meanwhile, Allied Lend-Lease aid would keep flowing in, and the Soviets would continue pumping out manpower and tanks from the east. With Stalin gone, leadership likely passes to Lavrenti Beria, the head of the secret police or the NKVD, or Georgy Zhukov, a prominent Soviet military leader. Either way, the Soviets fired on. Stalin's death, paradoxically, might have actually strengthened morale within the country. The man who starved Ukraine and purged his own people becomes a martyr in battle. If he dies defending the motherland, it might stir soldiers to fight on even harder and do the same thing. And remember Napoleon. He took Moscow in 1812 and had to abandon it a month later. The Germans might hold it for longer, maybe a year max, but ultimately they'd face the same fate. So, how does this affect the Eastern Front as a whole? The Germans would be bogged down trying to hold Moscow. They wouldn't have the troops to spare for other fronts. Leningrad, still besieged, probably for even longer. With German resources tied up, they risk overextending, possibly leading to a quicker Soviet counterattack, though let's say for argument's sake the war drags out a little bit longer. I'd say the war in Europe ends around early July 1945 instead of May, and Germany loses just in time before it can be given the atomic bomb treatment. But Once America was in the war, Germany had no realistic path to victory. The Soviets bore the brunt of the fighting and would keep slugging it out as well. Would the Western Allies speed up their plans to take pressure off the Soviets? Maybe, but it's unclear. Would neutral countries jump in? Not likely. Spain and Turkey would continue hedging their bets, trading with both sides, and staying neutral unless absolutely forced into the war. Could Japan see the fall of Moscow as a green light to invade Siberia? Possibly, but Japan attacked Pearl Harbor instead because it needed oil, and knocking out the American fleet was more strategically important for securing the oil, which largely came from Southeast Asia. The USSR, in contrast, had nothing to offer in that department. Unless the Soviets were on the brink of collapse, and I mean the brink, Japan had no reason to risk going into Siberia, and again, losing Moscow wouldn't have meant the Soviets were done. In fact, Germany might end up worse off, which I'll explain in a little bit. Holding Moscow would further their position on the Eastern Front, which would theoretically lead to the war dragging on ever so slightly by a few months. So, what changes then? Because the Allies still land on D-Day or roughly around that time and liberate Europe on roughly the same schedule, the Soviets are a little slower, because they've now had to spend a few more months taking Moscow, and that gives the Western Allies time to push deeper into Germany. Maybe they even take Berlin this time without the Soviets getting there first. Austria would then fall into the Western camp instead of becoming a neutral power. That tiny shift on the Eastern Front in 1941 could ripple through the Cold War and all the way to Austria. If the Western Allies get to Berlin first, East Germany then might not even be a thing, and without East Germany, Germany might actually be split up permanently. The Morgenthau plan to deindustrialize and weaken Germany for good might have gone ahead. Churchill even had this weird plan to merge Bavaria, Austria, and Hungary into a Danube confederation, but this was a bit too out there to be taken seriously. And ironically, allowing the Soviets into East Germany is what saved Germany from total dismemberment, because after the Berlin Wall came down, they were able to reunify, which is a bit strange, right? With Stalin dead, the Cold War might play out differently as well. Agreements which had historically taken place between the Allies would now become irrelevant without Stalin at the helm. For example, the Greek Civil War could have played out very differently, and Greece could have fallen to communism, as there was now no percentages agreement between Churchill and Stalin which could take place, and Eastern Europe would have become a free-for-all. Yugoslavia might still be allied with the USSR as well, because Tito might have never had a fallout with Stalin. The Korean War would have never occurred, or at least not in the same way as it did in our timeline, because Kim Il-sung would have never received a blessing from Stalin to go ahead and invade the South in June 1950, so this also could have been a big what if. So, in the end, not much really changes. The Nazis were always going to lose the war. Capturing Moscow might slightly delay the inevitable, but it wouldn't alter the basic outcome. What it would change is the post-war world ever so slightly. Less Soviet influence early in the Cold War, a possibly divided or neutralized Germany, and maybe a slightly different map of Europe. What do you think would have happened? Drop your thoughts below. I love this geeky old history, and I can't wait to hear what you guys think. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next.